Toxic people are like emotional vampires, unless you protect yourself the right way. This powerful insight will teach you how to shut down their power without losing your peace. Most people don't realize this, but toxic individuals aren't just emotionally exhausting, they're neurologically strategic. They're often operating in a way that creates a feedback loop in your brain and theirs. They say something that triggers you, you react, and in that reaction, whether it's anger, frustration, or an attempt to explain yourself, they get what they want. It might not even be conscious on their end, but that moment, your emotional investment, gives them a reward. That reward is dopamine, and dopamine is powerful. It reinforces behavior. Just like a rat pressing a lever for food, when a toxic person gets a rise out of you, their brain registers it as a successful strategy. So they do it again. But what happens when you don't give them that reaction? What happens when you recognize that your emotional response is the currency they're trading in and you stop paying? What I want you to understand is that emotional regulation in this context is not just a moral virtue, it's a neurological intervention. The most powerful shift you can make when dealing with a toxic person is to interrupt the pattern. And the easiest way to interrupt that pattern is to offer no reward, no emotional spike, no drawn-out argument, no drama, no retaliation, not even a sigh of exasperation, just calm. Clarity. Space. That's it. Now, this might sound overly simplistic, but the results are incredibly potent. You see, the human brain, especially in individuals who rely on manipulation or emotional hijacking, needs consistent reinforcement to maintain a behavior. Once that behavior stops getting results, it starts to extinguish. That's not wishful thinking. That's basic conditioning. The same principles we use in neuroscience labs to understand habit formation apply here. The moment you become aware that your reaction is feeding their pattern, you gain control. And let's be clear, we're not talking about becoming cold or unfeeling. We're talking about creating enough distance between their provocation and your response so you can choose what's actually effective, not just what's reactive. It's the difference between being pulled into their emotional storm and standing calmly in your own clear sky. When you practice this refusal to feed the loop, your entire nervous system begins to respond differently. You become less anxious around them. Your heart rate doesn't spike the moment their name comes up. You develop what we call stress inoculation, the ability to stay regulated in the face of stress because your brain is learning there's no longer a threat that needs to be resolved by reacting. And that is the key. Toxic people survive on your reactions. It's their oxygen. When you stop reacting, they start suffocating in their own behavior. You don't need to yell. You don't need to explain. You just need to remove the reward. That one shift rewires the entire dynamic. Because the moment you stop feeding the pattern begins to die. One of the biggest mistakes we make when dealing with toxic people is assuming they want clarity, resolution, or peace. That's the lens we operate from because it's how most of us are wired. We value stability, connection, understanding. But toxic individuals are often fueled by uncertainty. In fact, they thrive in the space between your boundaries and your fear of enforcing them. They operate like viruses in the system, searching for loopholes, gray areas, and emotional hesitation. And the only way to immunize yourself is to create structure, predictable, firm, and emotion-free boundaries. Now, I want to be really specific here. Boundaries are not threats. They're not ultimatums, and they're not about punishment. Boundaries are a communication to yourself and others about what is acceptable and what is not. They are a set of rules you live by, not for control, but for protection, for energy conservation, for clarity. And the most effective boundaries are ones you don't scream about. They're the ones you quietly uphold every single time. When you make a decision that certain behaviors won't be tolerated, maybe it's verbal abuse, passive-aggressive digs, manipulation through guilt or silence, then your only job is to honor that decision consistently. Because every time you make an exception, every time you allow the behavior just this once, because you don't want to stir the pot, you teach that person exactly how to bypass your defenses. Your inconsistency becomes their strategy. Here's something most people never consider. Every time you reinforce a boundary, your nervous system learns that you're safe. Your brain starts to associate your strength with safety instead of conflict. That shift is massive. It moves you out of survival mode and into intentionality. It tells your mind and body, I am no longer available for this chaos. Now, this isn't about becoming harsh or rigid. It's about recognizing that peace isn't the absence of noise. Peace is the presence of structure. And toxic people don't just test your limits, they test your clarity. If you're vague, they'll poke. If you hesitate, they'll lean in. If you flinch, they'll press. But if you stay grounded, if you calmly reinforce the boundary every time, they lose their leverage. This is especially important when you're dealing with people who aren't outright abusive but subtly draining. Maybe it's the friend who only calls when they need something, or the colleague who always finds a way to shift blame. These interactions can be harder to call out because they live in nuance. But the principle is the same. If you allow it, you teach it. And the more often you say, "I don't accept that," without drama, without explanation, just with clarity, you start to create an environment where only healthy interactions can survive. That's how you train the people around you, not by demanding better behavior, but by allowing only the kind of behavior that aligns with your values. You don't have to fight. You don't have to convince. You just enforce the standard, quietly, consistently. That's what rewires the relationship, and more importantly, rewires you. Because once your boundaries are no longer negotiable, you stop attracting people who only show up to negotiate them. The most disarming thing you can do in the face of toxic behavior is something so counterintuitive, so grounded, that it immediately shifts the dynamic. You remain emotionally neutral. You stop reacting the way they expect you to. Because that's what they're feeding on, your emotional response. That's their fuel. And when you remove that fuel, when you no longer mirror the chaos they project onto you, the game falls apart. Toxic people are incredibly skilled at crafting situations that demand your reaction. They know how to press your buttons, how to twist your words, how to make a calm situation feel like a crisis, and if you fall for it, you hand over control. But when you stay steady, when your breath stays slow, your tone stays calm, and your words are measured, they lose that power. What's really happening here isn't about silence or avoidance. It's about regulating your internal state so that someone else's instability doesn't destabilize you. Because the truth is, emotional regulation is a superpower in environments where instability is used as manipulation. You're not shutting down. You're showing up with awareness, with restraint, with control. And you're doing it because you've decided that you get to decide how you feel, not them. Here's something worth considering. People who try to provoke you usually lack control in their own lives. So, when they see that you can remain centered despite their chaos, it's not just confusing, it's intimidating. Because what they really want is influence. They want access to your emotional world. And when you deny them that access, not with aggression, but with quiet composure, you send a clear message: this isn't a space they get to occupy. Now, let's be clear, emotional neutrality doesn't mean you become numb. It doesn't mean you suppress how you feel. It means you delay the reaction. You give yourself time. You create space between stimulus and response. That space is where your power lies. Because in that space, you choose how to respond, not based on their energy, but on your standards. When you get good at this, when you can meet manipulation with curiosity instead of defensiveness, or passive aggression with clarity instead of frustration, you start creating an environment that's inhospitable to toxic behavior. Because those tactics only thrive where emotional chaos is welcomed. They die in calm. This isn't easy. It requires training. It requires awareness. But it also creates a powerful feedback loop. The more you practice emotional neutrality, the more grounded you feel. The more grounded you feel, the harder it becomes for anyone to knock you off center. It becomes a kind of internal armor, one that doesn't block connection, but filters toxicity. And what happens when toxic people realize they can't shake you? They either adapt or they disappear. Either way, you win. Not because you fought harder or yelled louder, but because you refuse to be pulled into someone else's emotional storm. That's the power of neutrality. It doesn't make you passive. It makes you unshakable. When dealing with toxic people, one of the most overlooked tools we have is clarity. Not emotional explosions. Not subtle digs or cold silences. Clarity. Because clarity doesn't leave room for confusion, manipulation, or ambiguity. And toxic people thrive in chaos. They thrive when the rules of engagement are fuzzy. When you don't say what you mean, or when your boundaries are so flexible they may as well not exist. Clarity is uncomfortable for people who want to twist your words. It stops them cold, because it takes away the gray area they rely on. When you speak with precision about what you accept, what you will no longer tolerate, and what your limits are, you force accountability into the equation. You're no longer playing emotional chess. You're just putting facts on the table, calmly, directly, with no venom, no apology, and no permission required. Now, that doesn't mean you need to deliver long lectures or justify every line of your emotional policy. That's not clarity. That's defensiveness. Clarity is Simple. It's saying, this doesn't work for me. It's saying, that tone isn't okay. Or, if this continues, I'm stepping away. No theatrics. No threats. Just truth delivered without tension. When people hear the word boundaries, they often think about shutting people out. But boundaries aren't walls. They're doors. And clarity is the lock. You decide who gets access when and on what terms. And here's the most important part. You don't have to explain your locks to someone who's proven they can't respect your space. People who manipulate or control often count on the fact that you won't speak up clearly, that you'll stay vague enough that they can twist the narrative, that you'll second guess yourself when you try to express a need or enforce a line. They rely on the idea that you don't fully trust your instincts. So when you show up with calm clarity, it disrupts that pattern. It reclaims your authority in your own life. And yes, it will make some people uncomfortable. Not everyone will like it. That's part of the detox, because clarity filters out the people who were only in your life because you allowed confusion. The ones who stayed because your maybe was always open for reinterpretation. When you become someone who speaks plainly and acts in alignment with what you say, you stop attracting those who feed on loopholes. Clarity isn't cold. In fact, it's one of the kindest things you can offer, both to yourself and to others. It gives people a roadmap. It tells them exactly where they stand. It removes the guessing games and gives you a relationship dynamic based on respect instead of control. The people who are meant to stay in your life will meet that clarity with appreciation, not resistance. Because they're not looking to blur the lines. They're looking to build something real. And if someone can't handle your clarity, then the truth is, they were never handling you. They were only managing the version of you that bent, that accommodated, that hesitated. That version was easier to manipulate. But it wasn't honest. It wasn't powerful. It wasn't free. Speak the truth plainly. Set your standards without apology. Let your words match your values. Because when you become clear, you become untouchable. One of the most powerful shifts you can make when dealing with toxic people is recognizing that your emotional energy is a limited resource, and it's one you cannot afford to waste on people who are committed to misunderstanding you. There's a common trap we fall into, thinking that if we just explain ourselves better, if we're kinder, more patient, more understanding, then maybe, just maybe, that person will finally treat us with the respect we deserve. But that thinking is flawed, because toxic people aren't lacking in information. They're not confused. They understand perfectly well what they're doing. And the more energy you invest in trying to explain your worth to someone who's determined not to see it, the more power you're handing away. You don't need to spend your emotional energy trying to teach someone how to treat you. You show them once. You set the boundary. And after that, your focus shifts from convincing to conserving, because energy is not infinite. What you spend on the wrong people cannot be spent on the right ones. You can't be fully present with those who respect and love you if you're mentally consumed with how to fix someone who won't take responsibility for their actions. That's why protecting your emotional energy isn't just a concept, it's a strategy. It means learning to identify when someone is draining you with drama, with endless arguments, with guilt tripping or passive aggression. It means noticing when you're left feeling anxious, ungrounded, or small after an interaction. And then it means making the conscious choice not to keep engaging with that cycle. This doesn't require anger. It doesn't require confrontation. It just requires presence. And presence is what toxic people fear most, because when you're fully present with yourself, you become much harder to manipulate. You notice when your stomach tightens during a conversation. You pick up on how exhausted you feel after being around someone. And instead of pushing those signals aside, you listen to them. That's your nervous system talking to you. It's not being dramatic, it's being honest. So the next time you feel pulled into an emotional vortex, ask yourself, is this worth my energy? Is this how I want to spend my mental bandwidth today? Does this bring me closer to who I'm becoming? Or does it pull me back into patterns I've already outgrown? Toxic people depend on your reactivity. They need your energy to keep the cycle alive. When you go quiet, when you stop feeding the fire, when you emotionally unplug, they lose their fuel. This doesn't mean shutting down. It means redirecting. It means choosing to pour your energy into the people and practices that nourish you, into the conversations that elevate you, into the moments of stillness that restore you. You're not being rude when you withdraw from toxicity. You're being responsible. You're protecting a system, your emotional system, that determines how much clarity, love, and focus you can bring into your life. And here's the beautiful thing. Once you begin to fiercely protect your energy, your life changes. Not because toxic people disappear overnight, but because you stop giving them access to your power. You stop letting their chaos dictate your peace. You start noticing how much lighter you feel, how much clearer your mind becomes, and how much space opens up for real connection. Energy is your currency. Spend it wisely. If there's one principle I'd want you to walk away with, it's this: you teach people how to treat you by what you tolerate. That might sound simple, but when you really think about it, it's incredibly profound. Every time you stay silent when someone crosses a boundary, every time you make excuses for behavior that undermines your well-being, every time you try to keep the peace at the expense of your self-respect, you're sending a message, not just to them, but to your own nervous system, about what's acceptable. And once that message is repeated enough, it becomes a pattern. Now, here's where it gets even more interesting. People, especially those with toxic tendencies, are constantly scanning for your tolerance threshold. They're watching to see what they can get away with. Not because they're always consciously manipulative, but because human beings are wired to push boundaries until they meet resistance. So if you're not the one establishing that resistance, if you're constantly smoothing things over, avoiding conflict, rationalizing mistreatment, you're essentially granting them permission to continue. What changes everything is when you develop the ability to calmly, firmly, and consistently enforce your limits without apology. That doesn't mean shouting. It doesn't mean being cold or vengeful. It means getting crystal clear on what's okay with you and what isn't, and refusing to make yourself small to fit into someone else's dysfunction. And this is not about perfection. We all slip sometimes. We all ignore red flags we shouldn't have. But the moment you begin to act in alignment with your worth, you stop being available for dynamics that erode your confidence. You stop inviting people into your life who feed on your doubt. And more importantly, you begin to rewire your brain, literally, to associate peace, not chaos, with connection. Let me make this practical. If someone raises their voice at you, you don't need to explain why that's not acceptable. You need to leave the conversation. If someone repeatedly disrespects your time, you don't keep giving them chances. You change your access. These aren't dramatic moves. These are adjustments that signal to your nervous system and to others that you respect yourself too much to keep dancing in circles. When you take this approach, you'll notice something fascinating happens. The people who were only around to take, manipulate, or control begin to fade out of your life. Why? Because you're no longer a match for their patterns. You're no longer the source of emotional supply they depend on. You've stepped out of the game, and without your participation, the game ends. And that's the real shift. Because at the end of the day, we don't get to control how others behave. But we do get to control how often they get the chance to do it around us. That control is what true power looks like. Not in trying to change other people, but in holding your line so clearly that they either rise to meet it or exit by default. So when we talk about removing toxic people from your life, we're not talking about confrontation or revenge. We're talking about clarity, about calm detachment, about making your emotional space so grounded, so non-reactive, so aligned with self-respect, that anything not on that frequency simply doesn't survive. And once you start living like that, once you start showing up as someone who truly honors their boundaries, something beautiful happens. You stop attracting toxic people altogether. Every challenge you've faced with toxic people, every moment of second guessing, shrinking yourself, or over-explaining has led you to one powerful realization: you don't need to fix them, save them, or change them. You only need to honor your peace enough to walk away from anything that threatens it. The way smart people handle toxicity isn't with more words, it's with fewer chances. It's with action, with clarity, with an unshakable commitment to protecting their energy, not proving their point. Because the moment you stop reacting, you start leading. And when you lead with boundaries, with calm conviction, and with unwavering self-respect, everything toxic loses its grip. You're not just avoiding dysfunction anymore. You're building a life where it simply can't survive.